Okay, welcome to this episode of the Chicago State University's video series highlighting faculty members who participated in the Gardner Institute on high impact teaching practices for online learning. With us today is Professor Michael McNicholas. And Professor, we are delighted that you agreed to be part of this interview series. Thank you so very much. Would you please share with our viewers what you do at Chicago State?
So thank you very much, Deb. I am in therapeutic recreation in the HPER department, and I teach all the courses that have to do with the therapeutic recreation degree emphasis, which is under the recreation degree that you can get as a bachelor's. I will be teaching courses coming this fall in the master's collaborative program with the MBA and an emphasis in recreation at Chicago State University, just approved.
Yes.
I'm very excited about that because it's going to have a lot of non-face-to-face components to it. It won't necessarily be online, but it will be a lot of non-face-to-face. And so there's a lot of construction that's going to go out of what my experience was with high impact learning that's going to go directly into building out the new courses.
So what would be non-face-to-face but not online? What kind of experiences are you expecting?
So more like hybrid, but I would probably be trying to facilitate simulated board meetings, for example, simulated strategic planning meetings, for example, learning to do collaborative series on how to do community impact assessment, learning to do community health index and inclusion assessment, which are tools that are used in community building and capacity building that people who are seeking a master's degree who serve in parks and recreation entities are going to try and use to incorporate why they need additional resources or how they should use their resources better to meet the specific needs of the people in their communities.
Yeah, that new concentration in the MBA program does sound fantastic. And it sounds like you're really incorporating all that performance-based assessments and authentic teaching and learning. So sounds exciting. And you mentioned you're envisioning utilizing a lot of the Gardner Institute practices. Before we get to some of the specifics, can you tell us why you even decided to participate in the Gardner Institute?
Well, yes, thank you. The COVID had forced us to go online and be at a distance from our students, and that was very shaking to a lot of our students. And so I identified immediately some of the learning differences between some of our students. And then the circumstances around their lives had changed so much that a lot of the things that we used to assume were okay to teach in a synchronous way were no longer accessible for those students. Some of them had to go back to circumstances where they had to be a breadwinner for their home. Or, for example, if they worked for Chicago Park District, well, the Park District closed up its hours and your nighttime shift, which was okay when you got approved to take classes, no longer existed because shifted hours. They kept you on and that was great, but now your hours were 9 to 5 or 8 to 4 or et cetera, et cetera. And that caused you to not be able to go and attend class regularly in the same way as you were before that. So being educators and trying to be sympathetic and flexible the way that we probably should if we're trying to serve our students as best we can, I immediately shifted to a more online model. I felt overwhelmed because some of my assessments didn't quite make sense as much anymore. I was kind of really looking for other ways of assessing contact and whether or not content was being absorbed and shared other than just forum posts.
Right, right.
So I was looking for something to help guide me and give me the best ideas of our time and what we had out there. And so when this high impact opportunity came along, I jumped at it because frankly, I needed that network and I needed that support to help develop my courses, knowing we were going to continue to face this and that online learning's not going away either.
Right, right. And kind of exciting that there were 30 plus CSU faculty members that participated in that institute as well, which is pretty amazing for something like that. So, so what would you say are some of your biggest takeaways from participating in the training? Some of the big things that you got out of it?
Wow. So I really liked the idea of how rubrics were structured differently, and sort of the freedom and permission that came with brainstorming new rubric ideas. I know sometimes we get hung up on a rubric that we get handed early in our career, which is certainly the case for me, for something like engagement in forum posts. Um, we had on campus a little bit of we have what OCT, online certification training. And so it's got a rubric that they suggest. And frankly, I kind of adopted that and just assumed, okay, well, this is what I have to use. And then I learned it's not. And it could be more dynamic language. We could look at ways that you assess whether learning was happening with different rubric structures or things that happened within the rubric to inform students like, listen, I'm really listening in your engagement in this forum, asynchronous forum, for your use of these words or your use of this vocabulary list.
Mm,
And using that as a supplemental tool was like, it seems so obvious. I would have done it in class,
mhm,
do it online right away. And
mm,
seeing it in that format kind of just triggered that, of course, I need this. Of course, I need this bridge. Um, I think also one of the things with respect to video learning, asking them to reflect on different video resources that you decide that you're going to impact. I started using that a lot more. I didn't use it as much because I play videos in class and kind of enjoy the organic exchange of right then, right there. What's your impression? One
yes.
of my favorites is in one of my classes where we're studying rec philosophy. We talk about a major American festival of arts and exchange that happens every single year. And I play a video from it, and it's a very wild video with a lot of artists that are very free spirited. And then we have a good discussion about it, and it's good to see the students react to it. But in an asynchronous fashion, that's a lot harder to
Yes.
facilitate, especially when students can no longer all be at the same location at the same time. So
Mm,
for me, it was interesting to use like little bits and pieces and kind of feed it into smaller pieces and get lots of little interactions as opposed to one big interaction that I had to have one big conversation around, and kind of break that up over the course of maybe a couple sessions, or an expectation of seeing it and responding to it over the course of a week rather than this one class period where we talk about this.
mhm, mhm. All right. Yeah, because when you're in the room together, all those ideas are bouncing off of each other. So how did you kind of replicate that when you did use a video? How did you kind of try to replicate building ideas off of each other like that? You mentioned chunking it up a little bit and having, are, what were some of the ways you did that?
Okay, so one of the things was, for example, for that festival, what I asked was, can you name the total number of art forms that you saw in it? And then created a little quiz out of it.
Hmm. Hmm.
I mean, it was a simple thing, like, did you see this occur in it? And
Hmm.
what representation of this did you see? Ask 5 or 8 questions like that, and you can start to get a little bit of accountability for the students being able to recognize what in the vocabulary should be applied to what they're seeing in a real
Hmm.
activity, but also a little bit of accountability with them making sure that they saw the video and not
Yes.
commenting on other people's comments. And so that's an important measure too if we're really trying to be accountable to learning.
Yeah.
And to be able to answer those questions on our faculty assessment reports at the end. How did I assess learning, and did learning happen? Yeah, this is how I did, and this is how you can see it. And now I have an artifact that represents that.
All right. So
That was
the
the other thing.
rubrics were something. Oh, go ahead.
The quizzes were the other thing that like became part of online learning that was an interesting, like, I'm using this tool for a couple reasons. One was to talk about engagement, authentic engagement where they were learning, which is what I started calling it, was authentic engagement as opposed to,
Nice.
and I don't know why I made that distinction, but it's just something I started doing. And then the other part was accountability to attendance,
Hmm.
having a quiz. And I didn't do this for every class every time, but the classes where people were committed to that time and they didn't have a legitimate conflict that I could sort of excuse them from, I started emphasizing, okay, there's going to be 4 pop-up quizzes, and I'm not going to tell you when they happen, and they may be at the end of the class to help facilitate, like, did you just put me on mute and cut your screen and and tune it out?
Mhm.
Just do a pop-up quiz, and that did help keep people pretty aware and responsive in courses.
Okay. Yeah, I was just going to say, so you talked about, kind of in general, the thinking differently about rubrics and maybe using video a little differently. And you just mentioned some building in some accountability as well. So any other big takeaways from the Institute itself?
Personally, it made me braver with respect to how I want to embrace technology. I didn't realize even that I was kind of shying away from some of the opportunities, but after going through Gardner, I looked at Moodle itself, like the learning platform, in a completely different way. It seemed more accessible. It seemed like, well, why not? Let's try this. Let's see if I can just add it. It seemed more like a spice rack than a bunch of processes that I would have to learn. And so from that perspective, I think it's given me a little bit more to cook with, if I'm carrying this analogy out to.
Yeah, yeah.
But certainly it's one of those things that I think empowered me to get past the, it's not just apprehension, it's also the sort of build up to what you think it's going to be in the way of a burden of time to learn a
Mhm.
skill or to learn to use a new tool. Um, I think Gardner empowered me to just kind of blow past that and get into, like, okay, let's open up a tool,
Mhm.
do what it does. It made it more like, well, and they mention this a lot, and it's funny now that it's triggering back, but video gaming, you're learning.
Mhm.
I think that's, as much as I, in my mind, was criticizing it at first, like, I'm not making a video game out of stuff I am trying to convince them is serious. I think that in the end, though, like, the video game strategy is still based on a lot of, like, human reaction, human awareness, human behavior, and so yeah, video gaming it up a little bit does help.
And did you implement some video games in your classes this fall as a result?
I didn't put games in, but I put in behaviors that were game like,
Hmm,
including peer-to-peer teaching. So,
that's game-like.
well, when you can't have, I'm in recreation, right? So when we're talking about skill building for something like basketball skills, this is a legitimate example of what we had to do. Everybody had to have their screen up and they're putting it out in front of us. And what they would do were all the skills that you would identify in physical skills that you would assess in teaching a 3rd grade class, but they'd have to do it with the invisible ball and pass it to each other. And you'd have to see their hands physically reach out, fingers and thumbs. Let me see you receive it and say, got it. Let me see you call it with one hand. Let me see your hand position. And I would have them fake dribble, call out a name, bounce pass, or say chest pass. And so you'd be surprised at how really interactive that got. It seems like something
Wow.
to take off with students, but pretty soon they were like, okay, let's just make sure everybody's paying attention, Jay, you know, and they'd have to identify bounce pass, or they'd have to identify chest pass, and they'd have to pick a next person and go with it. And we'd move faster, and you could see that at least there was some idea about the need for communication
Mhm.
participating through that physical activity. And then you could see the physical activity, what they were trying to do, regardless of whether they had a ball or not.
Mhm. Mhm.
So
Wow, talk
to an extent,
about,
some of that kind of stuff is just imagination, but some
yeah.
of it is really great because you can see what they're doing.
Yes.
Another student did yoga, and they led the yoga class, and we watched everybody doing yoga in their backyard, and they did corrective posing, and a lot of very good feedback was had peer to peer. So I think there were a lot of things that I didn't think were going to work at all that ended up working pretty well.
Very cool. Very cool. So, was there anything in particular that worked that you're going to continue on
Oh,
toward the
for
future?
sure, some of the peer-to-peer stuff I'm going to do. In fact, one thing from this semester that's shocking me, even today, as of right now, is just how invested students got in doing interview reflections.
Hmm.
So I have a course that's the course you take, it's seminar before you do your internship. And this is where you go out and you find your internship and you practice putting your portfolio together and using your portfolio. And so I've always had outside professionals come onto campus and do a in-person facilitated interview with a peer who's also interviewing the student. So there'd be at least two people at the table interviewing the student.
Mm-hmm.
They'd have to get dressed up, the whole thing. And so this time, obviously, we did that video style. And so we did big blue button sessions, and they had peers in there as well, some of them, and some of them did it individually. I gave them an option. And they would go back and listen to their videos. And I had more than 3 students of the, I think it's 9 in that class. So like a third of the students reach out to me and say, Nicholas, I need to do it again. I got to do it again. That's a no.
Mm-hmm.
And when they came back and did it again today, I could not believe one of my students, Marie, was unbelievable. I mean, totally different student, so prepared and took the advice and ran with it. And a few days later came back and said, I'm ready, let's go. She dressed differently. She looked differently. She understood the orientation of the camera, completely prepared, 100% different interview. And so she really took the ball and ran with it. And so I was very excited about that. And I have another student who's preparing to do hers tonight after work. And she was another one who called me right away and was like, that doesn't work for me. What we just did, that first attempt it's not going to work.
Mm-hmm.
For me, this actually harkens back to an idea that I had a couple years ago for this course that I wrote in my faculty assessment report, that I should do a pre-interview.
Mm-hmm.
And later in the semester, I should do a post-interview, and I should measure the metrics that have changed in their physical presentation.
Yes.
Professionalism metrics,
Yes.
eye contact, ability to use their portfolio, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But I never had gotten around to that yet. This actually opened the door to that, I think, in a more accessible way, and has given me also the opportunity to leave them with the video so they could self-critique.
Mm-hmm.
I told this to June, Dr. Shingles, who is our department, the head of our department, and like my right arm. I told her, I'm like, this is the first time I'm looking forward to faculty assessment reports in the 8 years that I've been here. They don't seem like they're a burden to me. They seem like they're something that I just want to jot down my ideas real quick and make sure that I'm getting that ready for putting it in August and in July into my fall offering of this course, because I don't want to lose these ideas. A lot of them worked out very differently than I expected. And thank God for faculty assessment reports. I have somewhere to put my ideas for a minute and keep myself organized so that I'm better for our students.
Yeah.
And that's what I really care about, is being better for them. So.
Well, wow, you've already told us about playing basketball virtually, about doing yoga and getting feedback virtually, doing professional interviews. Those sound like fantastic ideas, and even as you're evolving with them, you're seeing other ways they can go, things that you can add on to them. So that sounds pretty cool. With the and again, kind of dealing with the remote environment, would you say that that the students like these alternative type of learning experiences? What's your sense of how the students, what the students thought of them, and then also, whether or not you felt that they were learning the content and applying it as well?
So I think that for some students, obviously they take to it faster than others. Some of them are still very nervous about the technology.
Mm-hmm.
I did spend a lot of time on that this semester, trying to get people past technology. I'm not going to lie, I spent at least 3 times as much actual contact time teaching either via phone calls or one-on-one meetings video wise. But I told myself that that was going to have to be the case before the semester because of all of the social conditions we're living under. If this were the kind of thing where it was class number 2, I'm expecting those who were learning from me last semester who are in other classes of mine next semester, which there are probably 10 people. Those folks are going to treat it like it's old hat. It's going to be super simple for them to jump and be like, okay, well, you know what, I got to get on over here, and I'm definitely going to have to account for this. But getting over that hump was not easy for students. Some of them really, they didn't participate with Moodle very well before. So now that Moodle was the learning platform that was one of the most accessible things, as opposed to just seeing me in the hall or popping by my office.
Right.
They had to do some adapting too. And, they have other things going on at home and other worries. And so I did talk to some people very specifically about their learning environment and home and learning to protect themselves and protect their space and learning to honor themselves and honor their commitment to this effort. There were some students who needed that kind of comforting. And I think that maybe that's something that we didn't emphasize as much in Gardner. Certainly we talked about student learning and andragogy and the idea of a good environment to work in, but a more expanded conversation of like, wow, what was it like having those conversations with students and really getting them there to get them there,
Yes.
Is warranted. It's definitely something that I didn't see that much time coming.
And yeah, you think that that the students would be digital natives and maybe not as afraid of the technology. So spending a little more time than you planned, helping them get comfortable with it was important, huh?
Yeah, there's also a few students who were digital natives, but they needed a little bit of redirection on their comfort level and professionalism with to, I mean, you can't just turn off your mic. You can't just turn off your screen, forget to turn off your mic and have the football game going on in the background. And then tune out. And pretty soon you see, like, I've shut you out of the meeting because you're so distracting to the class, and I'll send you an email at the same time and say, listen, I'm sorry, I had to drop you from being in this virtual meeting because your TV was like louder than my voice, or louder than anybody else could contribute to. It was too much of a distraction. So please, you need to learn some netiquette and make sure. And I think that that's probably something that I should consider incorporating either into my syllabus or maybe even into the introductory section of my learning module is what netiquette stuff I expect. A little netiquette video couldn't hurt. I think it would only help. And I feel like we're back in high impact learning right now where we're like trading ideas and like kind of so
brainstorming on the fly.
Yeah, pretty much. Like, okay, well, what happens in these circumstances? What can you imagine?
Yes. But really seeing things from the student perspective, especially our students that didn't sign on for online learning, right? Not only the technology, but the self-discipline and the scheduling and staying on top of things and balancing, as you said, all of the other tremendous obligations that they may have. So very cool. Any additional apps or anything that you tried that you wanted to mention as we're talking? You mentioned gaming. Did you do anything related to what's some of the popular ones, Kahoot, or any particular apps that you hadn't used before?
No, I used most of the stuff that was either in our learning module or our platform, excuse me, Moodle, or Zoom. I used GoToMeeting a little bit. I mean, I used a variation of different meeting site places. There's a couple that I'm yearning to try for next semester because there's a tourism class, which is actually probably going to be taught by our adjunct, but I'm going to hop in as a guest speaker a couple times. There's one platform that's based on putting together video conferences, video-based conferences. supposed to be really good, and I'm actually going to do the research on it um, this month and see kind of how I'm going to plan on integrating that, because I'm excited about it. I don't think video conferencing is going away from as popular as it's been.
Yes.
People are just attending like crazy. Even my personal Lions Club meeting, since we went to Zoom, has way more attendance than it had when we were in person. And everybody misses each other, sure, but
Mhm.
one of those things where you're like, wow, well, for meeting though, this is
Mhm.
this is really, really convenient, and a
Yes.
lot of people get involved. And that's the whole point, is staying involved and connected and learning and sharing. And so I want to try and integrate that into there, and then also into our Rec 4070 class, which is our technology class, which we're reinventing anyway.
Mm.
But I want to reinvent it around some good apps. And so
Mhm.
go back to some of the things that we had used as tools, some of the things that we were investigating, and insinuate that into the learning, as far as, why don't you take these tools with you and take them to the community when you get your job,
Yeah.
and be the leader that way.
Well, you said two pretty amazing things. You said, number one, this training kind of made you less afraid to try things. So that's pretty exciting. And then the other thing you said was it made you look at our learning platform in a completely different way. Can you say anything more about either one of those two things? Those are both very interesting.
Well, particularly for Moodle, since I didn't really have training when I first came on with Chicago State University, this was my first full-time faculty job. It was my
Mhm.
full-time teaching job. And so I didn't really have a whole strong understanding of even learning platforms at all.
Mhm.
My classes were face-to-face in my master's degree. My
Mhm.
classes were face-to-face in my undergrad degree. And then I spent a ton of time in a field that is all face-to-face.
Yes, yes.
And so by the time I got to CSU, and there was this learning platform thing I had to learn, and I hadn't had any training on it, um, it was already a little bit intimidating. And somebody gave me a book that was actually an older version of Train Yourself Moodle than the version we were using. So it wasn't quite copacetic, and pretty
Mhm.
like, man, I am just paddling as hard as I can to swim.
Sure, sure.
And so when we went through the change, I was getting used to our old Moodle version,
Oh, yes.
and then we did a change. And I
Yep.
was like, all right, well, most of my stuff is still here. So
If I can find it.
I'm gonna be okay. Breathe, Mike, breathe. And, and then I started getting braver with a couple little things. But man, after doing high impact learning, I was pretty much like, no, I've seen 3 or 4 different platforms for learning through high impact learning. Different people have described things that they use. I'm excited by some of their ideas. Do we have something like that in Moodle? Holy cow, yes, we do. It's right there. Oh my goodness. Or, those kind of
Yeah.
things. And then when I discovered that a couple of the kinks in the previous Moodle platform that we had in the version we had been kind of worked out in the newer one, I was like, all right, well, this takes away all my excuses for why you haven't gone back and done it. So
Mhm.
get off a keister and start programming, and make your class a little bit more how you envisioned it being when you envisioned it being its best class.
Oh, fantastic. Fantastic. So, as we kind of wind down and wrap it up here, I think that's a great segue to the last question, which is what advice you might have for colleagues who maybe were where you were prior to Gardner, as far as getting their toes wet a little bit more in the online high impact teaching practices. Any thoughts?
Yeah, my advice would be to invest in yourself as a professional, regardless of what you think about learning platforms, regardless of what you think about best practices, or all those debates that we have before we make a decision. Jump in the water, just get involved and do it. Once you have the experience of going through Gardner Institute, and then you also have the experience of doing our CTRA based learning for online teaching, you'll kind of get a little bit more proficient, but you'll also get a little bit more hungry for being able to deliver your ideas the way that you want to deliver them. And once you have the capacity to do it, it's just like anybody who never had capacity before. They didn't know what they were missing until they had the resources.
Mhm.
So don't deny them of yourself. be an advocate for yourself as the best teacher you can be, and use all the resources. In the end, if you don't want to use the resource, that's your prerogative. But wouldn't it be great if you were just capable of doing it if you needed to?
So don't just put your toes in the water, just jump right in full
Yes.
force.
Yeah, and take more than one. Take more than one training. Because like I said, I redid the OCT right at the same time or right after it. And, you know, there's just subtle differences, but it was enough that it was like, this is good. It's good reinforcement happening here. And sometimes we forget as teachers, we're learning too.
Yes, yes, absolutely, absolutely. And as you said earlier also, that there's going to be a lot of these components of remote learning that are going to be sticking around way after the pandemic is over. And
They'll definitely be in my classes.
yeah, yeah,
Sure. Classes that didn't have any the first time I taught them are definitely going to keep a lot of the online components because they're just too valuable.
yes,
At one point, I asked students to take their own videos and then post them and then comment on them. Well, now as opposed to having to do that, they can just jump in their own big blue button session and boom, it's up there.
that's right.
And then you
That's
got a
right.
forum right under it and everybody comments on it. If you don't, that's a measure of your participation in class. It's right there for you. I made it easier for you to learn. That's the point.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. And not only the students, but us as faculty. If we're not learning, we're not moving forward.
Yeah.
And I think participation in this video is also can be an inspiration for people to hear where you were and where you are in that short amount of time and the things that you've done, and that makes learning fun, exciting, and so we really appreciate your time and expertise today. Thank you so very much for participating in this series.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you again for asking.
Absolutely.
Happy learning.